we can get started. This chapter is entitled The Family. During ML's first winter in Brooklyn, he held meetings in a hall over a blacksmith's shop. Handbills were needed to attract people to the meetings, but handbills cost money, and he had little of that. Nevertheless, he could solve that problem. He would buy a hand press. What matter that he knew nothing about printing? Just a second here. What matter he knew nothing about printing? This would be the way to learn. So soon a hand press and a font of type were installed in the Andreasen's third-floor apartment. But where to set it up? In the parlor? Of course. That wasn't Annie's idea of a parlor, even in an apartment house, but she understood. The Lord's work came first, and the resultant handbills were attractive, bringing many hearers to the meeting. The next home for the Andreasen family was the downstairs apartment of a two-story house on Brooklyn's 56th Street. Each tiny bedroom barely held a bed. There was a tiny kitchen, then the tiny parlor. Of course, the printing press was set up there. Happily, there was a small fenced-in backyard where Vesta and Eunice could play in good weather. The third home in Brooklyn was on a second story on 76th Street. In this area, the streets all look alike, and the houses on the streets all look alike. All are made of the same brownstone material, but the rooms were larger than in their previous house. Besides, the streets went right down to a beach where baptisms could be held. To this home, ML one day brought a golden oak piano. Until the purchase of the piano, the family's little folding organ was carried like a big suitcase back and forth from home to meeting hall. Both ML and Annie played, hence the girls couldn't remember which one had taught them. At 10 years of age, Vesta was able to play for the meetings if necessary, and by 12, she didn't need to know the hymn numbers ahead of time. She could play most of them. It was not always the organ that was used to accompany the singing. On Sunday nights, a group of young people played guitars while ML stood up and led out in the singing. This group thoroughly enjoyed the necessary practice hours thanks to the wit and skill of the new pastor. He always had some singing group preparing special music for his meetings also. While living at the home on 76th Street, Eunice was badly burned. While she was watching a bonfire, her clothes caught fire from the embers, and she was burned from head to heels. Annie forgot her own sleep, trying to soothe the agony that seemed even more intense at night than during the day. When the doctors came to change the bandages, he would have to soak them loose before he could put on fresh ones. The pain lasted for months before the child was finally better. ML often referred to this experience as an illustration of how God must suffer when his children do. ML liked to take his girls for walks. One time it would be Vesta, the next time Eunice. Instead of having the child hold his hand, he would have her grasp his little finger. From time to time, as they walked along, he would raise the child off her feet and swing her along through the air, all from his little finger. From time to time, as they walked along, he would raise the child off her feet. Yes, I just read that. He started this when they were little, and he grew in strength as the girls grew in weight, so that he was still swinging them when they were far too heavy for the strain on his finger. One day, while he was swinging Vesta, the last joint of his finger twisted under the strain. He found permanent relief only years later when he had that fingertip removed. Occasionally, M.L. would take one of the girls to downtown Manhattan with him. Vesta delighted in fitting her nickel into the turnstile slot, climbing the wooden stairs to the elevated railroad, and standing on the platform, peering down the track for the lights of an approaching electric train. She can still remember looking out on the housetops, seeing the dingy washing hanging from lines between the roofs as the train rolled along. New York City had no skyscrapers in 1908, but the harbor boasted the, quote, eighth wonder of the world, end quote, the graceful Brooklyn Bridge, with its suspension span a quarter of a mile long. As their elevated train crossed East River on the upper deck of the bridge, M.L. told Vesta the story of its building. The German immigrant Roebling, who designed it, died of tetanus following an injury while surveying the site. His son became an invalid after being decompressed too soon after 12 hours in a Pioneer underwater compression chamber used in placing the foundation. For the remaining 11 years of the construction, he watched through binoculars from his bed, sending instructions by his wife. Finally, one May morning in 1883, he watched with deep interest as the completed bridge was officially dedicated. Vesta very carefully observed the station at which she and her father got off the train, which direction they went from the foot of the stairs, and the building they entered, where her father rented big glass slides for the stereoptician projector he used in his public lectures. After picking out the slides, he waited for the next meetings. After picking out the slides he wanted for the next meetings, he gave them to Vesta to take home while he went to his office for the day's work. When Vesta was 10, M.L. and Annie decided that she was old enough to accompany her father on an ocean voyage to Denmark. He arranged to have her stay with the family near the Skogsberg Sanitarium while he went to Germany to attend the Northern European Division Council. Because M.L. was working for Scandinavians in Brooklyn, all parts of the church services were in Danish. However, English was used in the church school the girls attended. Wanting their girls to speak Danish as well as English, M.L. and Annie decided on two measures to offset the English regularly used in the home. They would conduct family worship from the Danish Bible, and they would pay the girls a penny for each hour in which they conversed only in Danish. The plan worked, and the girls' Danish was saved from oblivion. M.L. taught his girls to ice skate and swim. In those days, Coney Island was not commercialized. It had only one hotel, and the lovely beaches were unspoiled. The drawback was the excessive clothing the girls and women had to drag through the water, sleeves and skirts that covered long bloomers. One day the beachman came along and told Vesta she must be sure to wear stockings on the beach and in the water. The Andreasen family split up during 1909. It had to do with church school. It was not possible to operate a church school that year, and ML and Annie would not even consider sending the girls to Brooklyn Public School, even though Brooklyn schools belonged to one of the best school systems in the country. They finally decided to divide forces. Annie and the girls went to South Lancaster, Massachusetts, where there was a good school, and ML got himself a room in Manhattan near his office, where he served as president of the Greater New York Conference. In referring to this period of temporary singleness, ML used to tell his students about letting his dishes sit until he had to sandpaper them clean. Next chapter. It had been a restful Sabbath. Now, as the sun was sinking behind the wooded hills surrounding the little valley, grandmother, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, the helpers in the home and office, and a few visitors were all singing together. Grandmother's clear soprano voice was plainly distinguishable. After several hymns had been sung, she began a vivid description of what heaven will be like. ML thrilled to realize that he was actually a member of this family, albeit for a few days only. Henry and Herbert White, the twin sons of W.C. White, who were sitting close to him, had invited him that morning to ride with them in their buggy ahead of their father, Willie, and grandmother on their 9-mile ride up to Pacific Union College, where grandmother was to speak. During the week, the children had pulled him out to the barn to see grandmother's new calf and to watch the day-old chicks and their mother eating grain. They had told him how little Arthur had tried to count the buttons down the front of grandmother's dress, but had gotten mixed up, and how she had put her dainty hands around him and hugged him. For a short while in the afternoon after school, before time for chores, ML had heard the children playing baseball in the large pasture. Later, he had found them by the well house, washing and cutting up apricots that grandmother had bought to be dried, then shipped to ministers' families in the South and to missionaries overseas. Tomorrow morning, ML would again sit at the table grandmother so graciously presided over. Maybe there would be the special treat of gems, whole wheat or unbolted cornmeal muffins. For dinner, he hoped there would be grandmother's favorite dishes, baked corn souffle, tomatoes and macaroni, and tiny cooked mustard greens. How did it come about that Andreasen was here at Elmshaven, a guest in the home of Ellen G. White? He has recorded the reasons for his going and what this visit meant to him and his life work. And he stated, "My personal contact with Mrs. E.G. White was confined to the latter years of her life and was of short duration. I had read her writings and to some extent studied them from the time of my baptism as a young man in 1894, and had met her personally on several occasions. It was not until 1909, however, that I began serious consideration of what the testimonies meant to the remnant church. I was at that time president of the Greater New York Conference and had read with interest the various messages concerning the work that should be done in the larger cities of the land. I was perplexed that apparently little had been done to comply with the instructions given. Elder E. E. Franks had been holding meetings in Carnegie Hall with good results. Elders S. N. Haskell, Luther Warren, G. B. Starr, Dr. Kress, and Professor Prescott had visited and worked in New York City. Mrs. White herself had visited the city, and it was felt that little more could be done at that time. This brought me to an extended consideration of the messages sent and how they had been accepted and acted upon. Some of them seemed to have fallen in good ground, while others apparently had been considered good advice, but not of compelling importance, and consequently had been neglected or forgotten. This study led me to a review of such evidence as was available to me bearing on the question of the origin of the writings of Mrs. E. G. White. Hitherto I had accepted the testimonies of others without any critical appraisal or profound conviction one way or the other. Now, however, I felt I had come to a point in life when I must make definite decisions for myself. This became the more necessary as I was shortly called to head the newly established seminary in Hutchinson, Minnesota, and would have to deal with young men about to enter the ministry. For their sakes, I decided that I must know for myself and not depend upon any secondary authorities, however good they might appear to be. This led me to consider a journey to St. Helena, California, where Mrs. White resided at the time. I wished to have first-hand knowledge as far as it was obtainable. I did not wish to be deceived, nor did I wish to deceive others. Consequently, in due time, I arrived at St. Helena and was cordially received by Mrs. White. I stated my reason for coming, which was to obtain permission to examine her writings in manuscript before anyone had done any editorial work on them. I had brought with me many quotations from her writings that were of outstanding interest either for their theological import or their beauty of expression. In my own mind, I was convinced that Sister White had never written them as they appeared in print. She might have written something like them, but I was sure that no one with the limited education Sister White had could ever produce such exquisitely worded statements or such pronouncements on difficult theological problems. They must have been produced by a well-trained individual conversant not only with theological niceties, but also with beautiful English. I was given ready and free access to the vault where the manuscripts were kept, and I immediately began work. I was overwhelmed with the mass of material placed at my disposal. It did not seem possible for one individual to have produced such a quantity of material, I'll say, in a lifetime, most of which was handwritten. I had imagined that Sister White dictated most of her writings, for she had helpers. Now I found that while she might at times dictate, most of her writings were produced by her own pen. It was these writings in which I was interested and that I examined. I spent several days at this work, and being a reasonably rapid reader, and with the assistance of the office staff, I accomplished my task. When I was done, I was both amazed and perplexed. Here I saw before my eyes that which I believed could not be done. I verified many of the quotations I brought with me. I saw in her own handwriting some of the statements that I was sure she had not written, nor could have written. Especially was I struck with the now familiar quotation in The Desire of Ages, page 530. In Christ is life, original, unborrowed, derived. This statement at that time was revolutionary and compelled a complete revision of my former view and that of the denomination on the deity of Christ. I had examined many of the manuscripts in the vault, with the exception of the family letters. Though the son, W.C. White, doubted that I would get permission to read them, Sister White readily gave me access, and so I read them. Here were the letters written by the parents to the children, and the children to the parents, by James to Ellen, and Ellen to James. Ellen's letters might begin with Dear James, or Dear Husband, followed by some remark or statement of a purely personal character, and then she would launch into an extended recital of some religious topic with appropriate admonition and counsel. If the few introductory remarks were left out, the complete letter could be printed on the editorial page of the review today. No name need be appended, and many readers would immediately recognize the origin of the composition. The same distinct phraseology, the same style and intensity of desire for a greater knowledge of God marked her writings, although at the time the letters were not considered as material for publication. When I was ready to leave St. Helena, Sister White presented me with several of her books, inscribed on the flyleaf with her own name, and also a small printed wish for the Lord's blessing. The only book I have left, with her name in it, is The Desire of Ages. I also took with me some of her unprinted writings that she graciously gave me. A few of these were handwritten, but mostly they were typewritten copies of communications she had sent out. Some of them had corrections in her own hand. When I knew her, Sister White was an aged woman, but in full possession of her faculties. She was gracious, considerate, and kind, a true mother in Israel. I visited her once early in the morning, but at whatever hour I came, she was already at work. There were some who claimed that she was already in her dotage. She must have heard this, for one morning she gave me 8 pages to read of what she had written that morning. After I'd read it, she smiled at me and said in a playful voice, "That's pretty good, isn't it, for an old woman in her dotage?" And then she laughed. The first time I heard Sister White laugh, I was shocked, for I did not think a person in her position should laugh. But laugh she did at times, a sweet, quiet, girlish laugh, altogether appropriate. She was good company, and not at all the stern, demanding, and commanding personality I had pictured her to be. She was a mother in Israel, and I came to love her. When I finally bade her farewell, It was with the profound conviction that I had been face to face with a manifestation and a work that I could account for only on the ground of divine guidance. I was convinced that her work was of God, that her writings were produced under the guidance of God, and that she had a message both for the world and the people of God. In writing this, I am not attempting to prove anything. I am merely giving my testimony of which I know, and that testimony is clear and unequivocal. I believe that the writings of Sister White are true messages of God for this church, and that no one can ignore and disobey them except at a great and infinitely great loss. Let me make this clear. I am not to worship Sister White or her writings. I am to preach Christ. I am not to consider her writings another Bible. As a Protestant, I must stand on the Bible and the Bible only. I am not to consider her writings an addition to the Bible presenting new light. I am to use them as a magnifying glass that does not create new truths, but makes plainer that which is already revealed. In my own life and thinking, I find them of surpassing value. I most highly recommend them to others. Next chapter. In 1909, there were 1.8 million Danish Norwegians in North America, speaking the language even to the fourth generation. And there was a strong trend to preserve Scandinavian culture in the United States. The University of Minnesota set up a center of Danish Norwegian art and literature. The Autumn Council meeting at College View, Nebraska in October 1909 decided that Seventh-day Adventists should have 3 foreign language schools in North America instead of trying to maintain various foreign language departments at Union College. A committee of 20 appointed to look for a site for the Danish Norwegian Seminary found a building and farm at Hutchinson, Minnesota, that the Danish Lutherans were offering for sale at an attractively low price. The large 4-story building was of pressed brick with rock foundation. Besides classrooms, it contained 46 student rooms, a pleasant dining hall, a chapel that seated about 400, and a good gymnasium. It was steam heated and had electric lights and city water. The farm was 160 acres. When O.A. Olson preached the graduation sermon for the 8th grade in the Chicago Scandinavian Church School, he told of the purchase of the Lutheran property in Minnesota. One of the graduates, Ida Christensen, turned around and looked at her father, the local elder, who had prayed for Annie Andreasen, asking for permission to attend the new school, and he nodded his consent. When school opened on September 28, 1910, the Andreasens and the other families invited to pioneer at Hutchinson had already moved there and had set up temporary living quarters somewhere in the one-piece school. The boys were assigned the top story. Beneath them was the girls' floor. The president's office, classrooms, and library chapel were on the main floor. The gym, dining room, and kitchen, laundry, and furnace room comprised the basement. The first thing in the morning for some days, Farm manager George Axelson or student Nels Nelson would hitch up the team and go down to the Great Northern Railway station to meet the students with their trunks. At length, 82 students were enrolled. Vesta, not yet 14, and Ida Christensen would go along having great fun. M.L. used to say that the only time it was quiet around the school was when Vesta and Ida were mad at each other and wouldn't speak. Eunice was the charming little girl who would go to meet Axelson after work and ride home on one of the horses. The teachers and their families ate in the student dining room at tables for 8. The seating arrangement was changed each month. The food was served home style. For supper, there would be applesauce, dark homemade bread, and a jar of sorghum bought by the barrel, plus foamy skim milk. There were no paid workers. Each weekday, as soon as classes were over, teachers and students would put on work clothes. There were teachers' cottages to build, ditches to dig, coal to unload, and wood to chop. Even if it was cleaning out the cesspools, M.L. was right there at work, father of the big family. Although the school taught only 7th, 8th, and 9th grades that first year, the students were more nearly of college age. The only certified teacher was Dr. J. M. Peterson from Heidelberg, a new Adventist devoted to raising the church's educational standards. To start out, the 8th grade arithmetic teacher was studying algebra, and the algebra teacher was taking geometry. During his 8 years at the school, M.L. was business manager as well as principal and president. Annie acted as bookkeeper and nurse, going back and forth, helping as needed. The first year there was a deficit of $550. The second, a gain of $370. By the third year, the enrollment had reached 104. By M.L.'s 8th year, the school was teaching college classes, lacking only 3 semesters of granting a degree. All Danish Norwegian Adventist youth were supposed to be at this school and receive all their instruction in that language. A few, such as Ida Christensen, who had only the Danish vocabulary learned in church, were unable to get the good grades they were accustomed to. It helped when M.L. agreed to teach general history in English. Anna Paulson, who became a student at Hutchinson in 1912, reminisces, quote, Prof had the habit of coming up into the girls' floor to see whether everything was quiet. Sometimes he'd come in and visit with us. I was rooming with Anna Sorensen at the time, and Prof's wife's name was Annie. Nobody's any good unless her name is Anna, Prof said. Then he gave me a look and said, You'll never amount to anything until you get to studying algebra better. I was having so much fun, I didn't care whether I got to algebra or not. In after years, I enjoyed twitting him about flunking me in algebra, and he answered just as happily, One thing I know about it, if I flunked you, you deserved it. I didn't flunk in anything else. Another Anna, an older student, who was also teaching sewing, somehow got a poor grade in algebra and was in a flood of tears one day in class. Prof didn't know what to do about her, but bravely went on through the class. The next day he brought a postcard and put it on her desk. It was a picture of a little boy and girl. her stocking halfway down, one leg dejected and crying. The printed legend read, "You know I love you, but I can't keep telling you all the time." And we all had a good laugh. A print shop had been set up in the basement. Prof would call, two or three of us down to help. Naturally, Speedy himself, he'd say, "Well, let's see who can fold the most of these." He got us working like mad, but it wasn't only the fine art of folding. I remember him in the potato bin with me, cutting seed potatoes for planting. He was also with us when we were all out picking up potatoes during harvest. In later years, we got too sophisticated for that, and how we missed it. The second year at school, Della Jensen came from South Dakota. Soon she was alternating with Vesta in playing the piano for Friday evening vespers. Della recalls, quote, "Elder Andreasen looked so majestic coming down the aisle in his long Prince Albert coat. But he could embarrass you if he thought you needed it. He had instructed Vesta and me sit on the front seat so that when I call the number of the song, you'll not have to come from way back to play." One week I'd forgotten I was to play, so when he announced the song, I started down the aisle. When I had come only halfway, he said, "Let's stand up and sing." One night, two young men and two of us girls went out for a boat ride. If everything had gone well, we could have been back before lights out, and nobody would have known the difference, but an oar broke, delaying us, and the boat leaked, getting our coattails wet. When we got back to the school, the lights were out, but the doors were open. There we were, dripping wet, around the bottom, tiptoeing down the hall. Prof's flashlight followed us all the way, up the stairs and down to our room, with not a word. We felt like mice. When I first went to Hutch, the school was new. There was a lot of landscaping to do. We had a horse and a sort of truck. Prof said one day, "Della, do you want to go along to get rose bushes? You're from the farm. You sit in the seat and drive, and I'll stand behind." It was a rainy, muddy drive. All of a sudden, the horse made a lurch, and Prof fell off the wagon, coattails flying, and there he lay in the mud. "Oh, I'm so sorry," I gasped. He never said a word, but got up, got back on the wagon, and off we went for the rose bushes. In the fall of 1912, a young man, F.M. Larson, later a missionary to China, arrived at the school at 4:30 in the afternoon after some transportation problems, to find the office was closed. It was 3 days before school started, and there were very few students around. He heard talking in the basement, so he went down and rapped at the door, and Elder Andreasen came out. "Where did you come from?" "Michigan." "How did you get here?" "I came by bicycle." "All the way?" "From Glencoe, 15 miles away." "Well, what's your aim?" "I've come to prepare for the ministry." "Well, that's good." Larson had a letter of introduction from a friend M.L. knew in Michigan. "You want to work?" "Why, sure, I want to work." And M.L. opened a door, and there was the kitchen. Larson took off his coat and started unpacking dishes less than 20 minutes after he arrived. There was a fruit room off the kitchen. One year, the night watchman began going there at night, picking the lock and taking fruit. M.L. decided to put a stop to it. He was hiding in the kitchen when he heard the watchman approaching, singing. I've reached the land of corn and wine. The humor of the situation so hit ML that he couldn't do a thing about catching the thief. He just went upstairs laughing. He could never sing that song again without remembering the incident. Another person said, I had Elder Andreasen for teacher in 2 classes. The best one was American history. He had a knack of holding his students spellbound, bringing out each event so vividly that we could almost see it taking place. I can remember how at 10 o'clock in the morning we'd all be sitting there waiting. He'd come in quietly, go to the board, write out some questions. We never knew what he'd pop on us. He had a way of picking out some things in the lessons that students ordinarily wouldn't notice. There were generally about 10 questions. All right, he said, write it out. During my last 2 years, I was an outside student. Late Friday afternoon, I would walk to school to practice with a quartet. When supper time came, Mrs. Andreasen would invariably invite me to supper. She was a wonderful cook. Every Friday night, we had the most delicious baked beans. In his home, the prof would invite me up to his study lined with books. In their bedroom, there was a little bedside table with books on it. He was a great reader, and he knew how to apply what he read. It was always a joy when Prof had the Sabbath service. He always brought out something worthwhile, right to the point, and always stopped at 12 o'clock. Some other speakers went over 20 or 30 minutes. One particular incident illustrated ML's policy not to ask anyone to do anything he would not do himself if he could. One summer, the boys were painting the trim on the 4-story brick building and had managed to finish the windows, but had no equipment for scaffolding. The eaves remained to be conquered. ML, true to his policy, knew who would paint them. Athlete that he was, he clung to the eaves day after day with only a toe hold above the windows. He finished the job without a slip. A non-Adventist wrote up the feat in the Atlantic Monthly, identifying neither president nor institution, but clearly it was about ML. As a boy, ML's ambition had been to stand on his head in front of an audience. Sometimes during the lively Saturday night marches at Hutch, he'd come into the gym, oh dear, walking on his hands. After he was 60, a former Hutch student asked him whether he still walked on his hands. Oh, yes, every day. ML kept on swimming into the last decade of his life. He would join the boys in the swimming. He would join the boys in swimming the mile out to the island in Lake Hook near the school. Between the school and town was a mill race in which the water was 10 feet deep. ML used to hold a big stone to keep him under water as he swam through beneath the paddle wheel. All the students were encouraged to take part in ice skating. ML, wearing a short coat, red stocking cap, and mittens, would help the boys clear the snow off the rink on the river. He skated so easily that it was like poetry to watch him. One time, after he had rounded the students up to go home, they asked for a little exhibition of his fancy skating. While performing, he leaned over backward just a trifle too far, and fell down. The students all laughed. ML regained his feet and soon was laughing harder then the rest. Even wrestling was not beyond the pale for M.L. Nelson reminisces, quote, one day at our annual picnic, he wanted to see how he could make out in wrestling. So he suggested that the two of us go to a secluded place in the woods and try our hand. He lost in the game. Two of the fellows had peeked and got a good laugh. Prof brought the little hand press he had in Brooklyn with him to Hutch. This is another paragraph. We outgrew that for a job press that was given to us. It had no inking fountain, so Prof and I rigged up a block plane to feed the ink onto the rollers. We worked all night on that. Night was nothing to him when something special was on. We had a new invention. That press served for some time. The next move was to buy a pony cylinder press, which we set up in a little basement room. The board decided we were to print the Northern Union Reaper, which came out each week. Prof was away, and the editor was anxious to have the next issue printed at Hutchinson. Moving everything from Minneapolis in that short time was something that only the ignorant or foolhardy would attempt. But somehow we got the next reaper out on time. When Prof came back, he shook his head. Nels, I never would have dared to do that. In 1914, George Axelson and I were scheduled to go to Denmark. We had already bought our tickets from New York to Europe, which cost $25 each. Then the war stopped everything. Prof urged that I come to Hutch to work for the rest of the summer. It was his idea to fix up the bathrooms with ceramic tile on the floor. Neither of us knew anything about laying ceramic, but we went ahead. There was nothing he didn't undertake. He was always there to back it up with his own labor. Another time, we were putting down sidewalks in front of the main building. The farm manager would let us use the team and wagon in the morning, but not in the afternoon when the students had work period. We had classes in the morning. Prof always had a way out. Nels, you have 2 vacant periods. You go out, get the team and wagon, and as soon as I get out, we'll go over and get a load of sand. I don't believe I ever saw 2 shovels work faster. Then I returned the team and we went back to class. Many people had a hard time understanding him, sometimes even his friends. He was quick to make a decision and too short in answering or explaining why he did as he did. Once, after he had administered certain punishment to one of the boys, Prof and I were working together in the print shop. I undertook to tell him I didn't think he was treating Tom right. That brought out his fighting spirit. I can still see him making little spits on the floor as he said, I've certainly got my opinion of someone that will criticize me for all the help I've given Tom. By then I realized that I, as a young boy, was wrong in trying to correct Prof, who was right. Our friendship was never broken. I believe we really understood each other. Even before the first graduation in 1914, the students who went from Hutchinson Theological Seminary were recognized as first-class burden bearers in their church. To mention only a few are A.W. Johnson, college president and General Conference Religious Liberty Secretary; R.P. Rowe, manager of the Pacific Press; Nels Nelson, superintendent of the Southern Publishing Association; Carl Martinson, consecrated physician; Anna Paulson, Edwardson, Dean of Nurses at La Sierra, especially did Hutch students shine as foreign missionaries. Chris Sorensen, married to Della, president of the Far Eastern Division, the Larsens in China, the Dahls in Manchuria, the Gordings in Manchuria, Shanghai, and Singapore. The General Conference liked to get missionaries for foreign fields from Hutchinson because these young people were consecrated. They also had a practical turn of mind. If they needed a house, they built a good one. If they needed something to eat, they would grow it in order to have variety in their diet. The people they went to help took well to these young missionaries. And that's the end of the chapter. And so we'll stop now since it is like 7:53. Okay, we will close with prayer. If you are able, would you kneel with me, please? Father, we are thankful for your word, for the spirit of prophecy, for the guidance you give us in both of these places. And yes, of course, the Bible is the word of truth, and the spirit of prophecy shines a light on the Bible, but it never takes the place of the Bible. And we're thankful for the firmness and solidity we have in the Word of God, and the help that is given us for these last days in the spirit of prophecy. So please help us to heed these documents, to read them, to study them, to understand them. Give us of your spirit. We need you, Lord, because times are changing fast, and it won't be long till this old world ends. Help us to be ready for that day. Bless each one who's with us. Guide their feet, their thoughts, protect them in the days to come until we meet again, I ask. In Jesus' name, amen. And so may you be blessed of God in the next few days. Be healthy and happy. And until then, may God bless again, of course. Bye for now.